Okay, now let's talk about the democratic recession. I'm not going to have time to go into a lot of detail here. I'm going to come back to this later in the course, but I'll introduce the problem, the phenomenon, the drama of what we are increasingly slipping into, first of all, with the following summary points. For the last 12 years, we've been in, I think, what is increasingly revealing itself to be a new period in world history. Maybe not yet a reverse wave. We don't yet have the quantitative indicator that Huntington would call a reverse wave, which is a long period in which there are manifestly more breakdowns of democracy than transitions to democracy. It's kind of much more ambiguous, but we have these 6 other trends that I think add up to at least a deepening democratic recession. And they are declining global levels of freedom and democracy, particularly a deteriorating rule of law in the world, and so then you get that ebbing of the liberal element, a wave of illiberal populism, which I'm going to define, increasing political polarization, which I've told you is often a prelude to formal democratic breakdown. Now we see it in the US, we see it in Western Europe. It's all over the place in the world now. It's just pervasive. This is being magnified by social media, and we will look at that. The rising influence of newly resurgent and powerful, on the international stage, authoritarian states, Russia and China, that are trying to promote their models and subvert and undermine democratic systems. And then, to me, in some ways, most alarmingly, a decay of democratic quality. In the core of democracy, historically, Europe and the United States. So again, we've got this slide. You see the break point, but I want to present it in another way. Another way to look at the Freedom House data, and now we'll go to the 100-point scale, so we've got a kind of more refined quantitative scale than just the 2 7-point scales, is just to ask, in every year, how many countries improved on that 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties, and how many declined? And what was the balance? Between 1991, beginning of the post-Cold War period, and 2005, you can see the ratio of gains in freedom to declines in freedom was very favorable. In most years, 1.5, 2.5 times as many. In one year, 3 times as many countries gained on their 100-point Freedom House scale than declined. And that just reverses itself beginning in 2006. And that was kind of a year of parity, but beginning in 2007, you have about 11 continuous years in which many more countries decline in freedom than gain. And so the ratio is usually about 50 or 60% as many countries gaining in freedom as the number that decline. You had a question?
No.
No.
And
No.
do you think that would be relevant, or would it be at all?
But Freedom House has a separate representation of that. And actually, that's even worse. If you look at the countries, I might have something here that refers to that, but if you go to the annual Freedom House report for last year, Freedom in the World 2018, they have some slides that show that. And there were many more countries, if you say how many countries over a period of time, say 5, 10 years, experienced at least a 5-point decline in that scale. I might have that here somewhere. Well, I'm not finding it quickly. How many had at least a 5-point decline in that scale? There were many more, or 5-point change in the scale. There were many more declining than there were gaining. So the big changers were mainly decliners. okay? Moreover, again, you know, this is an effort now to get beneath the superficial quantitative data and ask, what's really going on here? And what's really going on here, again, this is, look, I've been looking at this stuff for 40 years. And so, you know, I've got some historical perspective as a result. And I can tell you, over the last 40 years, we have not seen a situation where every category of regime was deteriorating, okay? So the authoritarian regimes are becoming more authoritarian. I think China is a metaphor here. It's gone from being a very authoritarian state to an Orwellian surveillance state that is monitoring everything, every digital footprint that its citizens are leaving. And I warn you increasingly that you will be leaving as well. We can talk about that another time. The competitive authoritarian regimes, many of them are actually exiting out of the category of competitive authoritarian into just plain authoritarian. So opposition is gone from the Cambodian parliament. Not a single seat now is occupied by an opposition member. Uganda, many other African countries, you can kind of see the slippage. Many electoral democracies we see kind of slipping down out of the category of electoral democracy, not in the old way by military coup, but just by elected executives in Turkey and Venezuela, in Bangladesh and so on, grinding down freedom of the press, freedom of association, judicial independence and so on, until independence of electoral administration, the freedom of businesses and individuals to contribute to opposition party campaigns, until you get such a decimation of this institutional, social, civic, and normative infrastructure of democracy that you just have this hollow shell. And the hollow shell is called competitive authoritarianism. And then the liberal democracies are becoming less liberal. Another way to try and grasp this quantitatively is to just look at democratic breakdowns. Okay, I've got a data set that has enabled me to do this, and each year we can ask, you know, how many democracies disappeared. And if you aggregate that by decade, this is what you get. During the first decade of the third wave, okay, you know, it's a kind of 42, 43-year period here now. So some of the decades are 11 years rather than 10 years to try and get, you know, 4 relatively co-equal periods. But it's good enough to make this point. During the first roughly decade, 1 out of 6 democracies that existed during that decade failed, 16.9%. And then in the next 2 decades of the third wave, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s and the mid-'90s to the mid-aughts, ending in 2006, the rate of democratic failure declines dramatically to 10% or less. And now we're back up in the last decade to roughly the failure rate of the preceding decade, 1 in 6. So you see, it kind of suggests growing fragility of the third wave. Moreover, this is a separate point I want to make to you that's worth bearing in mind. And that is the whole reason for the course, in a way. Democracy is not an easy system to maintain if you can even get a successful transition to democracy. And so 1 out of 3 democracies that has existed in this 43-year period, now really soon to incorporate the data from the 44th year of this long historical period, 1 out of 3 has failed. and sometimes in countries like Thailand, repeatedly. Okay? Now, the means of failure, I see a smile here from someone who knows this program very well because this country has been living through it. The means of failure is not what it used to be as the paradigmatic process of democratic demise. It used to be democracy wasn't functioning well, there was political polarization, there was weak support for it, there was corruption, maybe a brief spurt of hopeful legitimation, and then a palpable draining away of democratic legitimacy, and the military steps in. They claim to save the country, but once you have power, you can help yourself to the wealth that comes with it. So, you can figure out or guess at what the motives of military saviors are, whether patriotic or factional or institutional or personal. But in any case, it was often military, and sometimes a one-party regime would result. Sometimes a dictator would just, like Fujimori, say, I'm the only answer to the country's problems. I'm suspending the Constitution. I'm suspending the parliament, and I will rule in emergency fashion to save the country. It is still the case that democratic norms are strong enough in the world now that it's hard to get away with that. So what aspiring autocrats do is just batter away at the institutional architecture of liberal democracy and of constraints on executive power and the formal political constraints by the judiciary, the legislature, and crucially, institutions of horizontal accountability. And the fact that they go to work on them so early and relentlessly should tell you how important they are to the survival and health of democracy. And on civil society, the press, the universities, the business community, and so on. And it doesn't happen all at once. It's an incremental process, what I call a 12-step program, that gradually isolates one sector and then another until there's really no opposition left. And this is the means by which Recep Tayyip Erdogan, over an extended period of time, has decimated democracy in Turkey and created now a very authoritarian, competitive authoritarian system. This is the means by which Viktor Orban in Hungary has created, he calls it in a liberal democracy, I call it in a liberal competitive authoritarian regime. Because if you look closely, more closely than what Freedom House has been willing to acknowledge so far, more closely than what the European Union has been willing to acknowledge so far, you cannot, in my view, look at Orban's radical reconstruction of the Hungarian constitution, grotesque gerrymandering of electoral districts, war against civil society, and now the universities. You see that the European University is moving from Budapest to Vienna because it can't survive in Hungary. War on foreign funding for democratic civil society and human rights and grassroots organizations. You can't look at this and conclude that the people can choose their leaders and replace their leaders in a free and fair electoral process. And indeed, in the last election in Hungary, Orban got a smaller percentage of the vote than the one by which he lost the prime ministership, I think something like a decade or so ago, but he'd so gerrymandered the process that it didn't matter anymore. When you get a leader like Erdogan saying, as he did when I was in Turkey a few years ago for the Amends Conference after the municipal elections, we're the owners of this country, We, that is the people who support my party, the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, they're the real people. They will not bow. Turkey is invincible. Those who revealed state secrets, you know what he was talking about here? Tell them. Huh?
Can Dündar.
Explain.
Can Dündar is a Turkish journalist, and he was the editor-chief of a major Turkish newspaper. And he made a story about Turkish deep state aiding ISIS. And because of that story, he was labeled both an agent of the West, and also the story was told to be not true, which is a contradiction in itself, take it as you will. And then he fled to Germany to avoid prosecution, and there was an attempt of assassination on him. And now he's in Germany, and Turkey is demanding his extradition.
Along with Gulen in the United States and so on. Anyway, the point is, when you've got this kind of language intimidating the press for and advocates in the opposition, it's signaling something. I'll give you a different quote here from a Ugandan, a very brave Ugandan lawyer who I think may be on campus very soon. If he is, I'll let you know. His name is Nicholas Opio. He's been at Stanford before as a human rights lawyer and has been one of the major legal defenders of a very outspoken and courageous movement for lesbian, gay, transsexual, bisexual individuals in Uganda. And of course, another thing that these autocrats need to do in order to justify their concentration of power and their 12-step program is to find enemies. And the enemies can be outsiders. The enemies can be ethnic minorities. They can be immigrants. Anybody who's vulnerable or different. So sexual minorities work perfectly well in this regard for stigmatization. And Opio's point was this, that it used to be the case that these leaders were constrained in what they felt they could do because they feared Western pressure, Western denunciation, Western sanctions if they crossed certain lines. His point, conveyed to me after Ugandan military soldiers in uniform went into the halls of the Ugandan parliament and physically beat members of the opposition for voting against a bill to allow Museveni to run for re-election because 30 years had not been enough time and power for him. His point is these people don't have any fear at all anymore because they don't think the West is going to stand up for this, which again highlights the international dimension of all this.